Well, welcome to Bishop Jane Alexander and Mary Obiero together today as our continuing exploration of the theme of climate change and gender. We're going to look specifically at the impacts of climate change related or climate change induced emergencies on questions of gender. Because as we know, and as the UN has documented quite clearly, women are impacted differently than men when climate change related emergencies happen, just as they are impacted differently by climate change in general. What do climate change related emergencies and gender have to do with one another anyway? And maybe I'll start with you, Bishop Jane, from where you sit. What have they got to do with each other?
Well, I think I like to start with what the UN Commission on Women said, which was that climate crisis is not gender neutral. And I think it's the idea that whenever there is a climate catastrophe or just the changes in the climate that we're seeing, then already existing gender inequalities and difficulties are amplified, and they pose unique threats to women. We have, so I think they describe it as a threat. Climate change is a threat multiplier for women and vulnerable people, and that it includes problems with economic difficulties, but also existing problems, particularly around gender-based violence as well, are amplified as stresses and availability and limited access to services and healthcare and things increases. Then the effects on the more vulnerable among us in society, usually women and children, are amplified. So I think that's maybe a hidden piece of what's going on, in the same way that kind of during the COVID pandemic, we had this kind of silent pandemic of gender-based violence that was increasing across, certainly across Canada, and I believe across the world actually, that is there, that thread is there in climate change and climate-induced disasters as well. And so I think anyone that thinks that these things are not connected, I would say, please, please, please go to the UN Women's site and just read the very basic ground document, and you will certainly, you'll change your mind.
It's obvious that climate change and gender, they are intertwined. The effects of climate change actually destabilizes the ecosystem. And when I talk specifically on Africa, in the women in the Horn of Africa, when the ecosystem is destabilized, then that means their means of livelihood, their means of sources of income, they actually destabilized, and in some cases, they may not even exist. And in this case, it's the woman who faces very much. For example, in areas where we have been providing food for emergency or relief food, the reality is that in these particular communities, especially the pastoral communities, one man has more than one wife. And if the emergency comes as a problem caused by climate change, then the man literally takes off. They move to either urban centers and actually leave women and children behind to face the consequences of climate change, face the famine, lack of water. We have seen cases where women are trekking 10 miles to bring home just 4 gallons of that water. When there is emergency, that distance even increases. And it's basically for the woman to do that, because it's the woman who is supposed to cook the food. He needs the water to cook the food. The man will not be there. On the other hand, the woman and the girls are left home without food, as animals are the source of income. So basically, when we are looking at the effects of climate change in the Horn of Africa, the most affected person is the woman, because it's the one who actually meets the effects of climate change on a daily basis.
Both from thinking of programmatic responses, so relief programs and then longer term development programs, but also what we need to be advocating for, what kinds of responses need to be happening in terms of climate change induced emergencies and gender. How does gender need to be taken into account?
I think the first thing that we need to think about is to do a climate change vulnerability assessment, get really to understand the depth of the challenges, the depth of the gaps, and the depth of the resources that is available, the capacities that exist and the capacities that do not exist. When we have done this assessment, then we can develop a climate change with the gender focus adaptation framework. And within that framework, we can be guided on what can be done where, at what time, and with who and by who. Looking at that, then it means that the involvement of climate change adaptation or any responses, even if it's emergency response, it needs to be inclusive in the sense that we need to bring everyone on board. We need to look at the stakeholders, we need to look at the government, both the national and the county governments, and even the local government at the village level. We need them to get involved. We need the women to get involved, not just women at the community level, but we need to be looking at women at my level, women above my level, and women at that particular community level, so that we support each other to be able to do a capacity assessment and come up with where we have gaps, where we have capacities, what we need from outside and what do we have from within that we can be able to look into. And another thing that I would want to bring to the attention is the aspect of the indigenous knowledge in adaptation on climate change. Climate change did not just begin today, and climate adaptation has not begun this evening. It began a long time ago. Communities have been adapting to climate change using their own knowledge. So it will be very important for us to try and within that vulnerability try to get to understand the indigenous knowledge.
Well, I so agree with the points that Mary made, absolutely. And I think we may be many miles apart, but the same underlying things need to be put in place, because I think when climate disaster or change hits, it kind of, there are already kind of some systemic marginalization and discrimination pieces in place that are just amplified by that. And so the chance of being able to sit down and look as a whole community and to look at adaptive change is so important, because then we're trying to set things up, not just to affect the immediate disaster, but we're actually trying to set things up for the future that will be healthier across the board. And I think it's an opportunity. And when we do that, we kind of have a net approach so that we have a much more complex way of looking at how our systems are working, rather than what can happen in an emergency. And we saw it happening in response to the fires that we had, the terrible forest fires, and then the floods, where people come up and there's just a discrete kind of list of tasks. Well, we need to do this, and then we'll do this, and then we'll do this. And the women were juggling all of that. And I think a more adaptive approach that allows more people from different areas to speak into it, men as well. But in terms of what they're seeing, it means we come up with a much better plan. So involving not only people who are doing housing support and food support, but also people who are providing healthcare, social supports, and education, because it's usually, for us, we found it was the people, it was the elders in the community, the teachers and the healthcare workers who really knew what was going on and who really knew the needs of the community immediately, but and long term. And that becomes really important if you're trying to make an adaptive plan for the long term.
I wonder if both of you have an experience or someone you've met through your work that kind of illustrates what you've been saying at a general level, someone that helped you really out of their lived experience helped you understand, what this is all about.
There is. And she's one of our Indigenous pastoral elders, and her name is Pauline, and she looks very deeply at a situation, and unlike me, because I talk too much and too quickly and everything else, but Pauline is a deeply spiritual person who looks takes in what's happening and then shares kind of some very deep thoughts. So she had particular things that happened during the emergency. One was she was looking around, we talked about Indigenous knowledge, but in the region that was taken out by the fire, a lot of the Indigenous food sources were completely destroyed. So that wasn't just fruits and vegetables and medicines, but it was also some of the traditional hunting grounds were completely destroyed, and the salmon run in the river there, because the fish that people had used a lot of the time and then preserve and eat year round, that had already been reduced by climate change. And so Pauline was noticing that even when some of the elders came back into the community and some people came back into the community, they were still so traumatized, and the things that would help them was that sense of being home, being able to see home, taste home, smell home, as it were. And so encouraging people to go out, and if they were on the land and if they were hunting or fishing or collecting food, to collect more, to be able to share it with people who came back. So these traumatized people, so that they could feel they were home by having the foods they recognized. And also she spoke about, you would see people walking around after the disaster had struck, and she talked about they were there and they were doing the things that needed to be done, but behind their eyes it was as if their soul, their spirit and their body were completely disconnected, and needing to find ways that people could be together just to talk in culturally appropriate ways, but providing the space that was needed.
The reality is that in Africa, people do not have adequate information, or they don't have information at all. Things just happen, as you say. But specifically, I wanted to know if women have information about climate change. And for that reason, we used participatory methodologies. And there was this one lady called Agnes in Kitui. Agnes is now 89 years old. By that time, he was 87 years old. We found Agnes to be very, very instrumental in a way that Agnes understood what happened in that community 70 years ago, how things looked like, how the water sources were, how the vegetation was, how the planting, harvesting, weeding seasons were. Agnes could actually explain. And there is a huge thing. Over 70 years, a lot has changed. Even people in that particular community were really shocked that things have changed that much. In that particular community, any river had water flowing 70 years ago. It had water flowing. At the moment, it's just about 5% of those rivers that have water flowing. In the same particular community, people planted at a specific time of the year and they had a bumper harvest. That means they had enough rain. At the moment, that rain, it can come after 4-5 years or not come at all. So we made Agnes one of our climate change champions in that particular community. Not for anything else. Let Agnes walk around and let Agnes just tell people what climate change is. Because from where I'm standing, Agnes understands climate change much better than what I've read in books.
I'm seeing a really wonderful connector here of elder wisdom that is so key in our lives in so many ways, but just that long-term perspective that only elders can have.
Yeah, and if I can jump in, because like Agnes, Pauline and the other elders, they knew what the land was like before, and because they know that, they can not only talk of change, but when there are times when they've seen the land heal.
What would you want to say to PWRDF about what we need to be thinking about in terms of applying a gender lens to our work with you?
One thing that I would want your team to put in mind as we integrate gender into climate change resilient programming is to try to look at long-term programming. Long-term programming that will involve women at the moment, they need to be involved. And not just women at community level. I'm looking at women at regional, national women will be able to put advocacy issues on the tables of government, tables of funders, tables of those who must be included and those who must hear those voices.
Also, I think that what we're seeing is that when people are displaced, then we're finding that with the younger people, then they're losing that knowledge of food supply on the land they come from. And so to help with the education of that piece in terms of, the natural hunting and fishing and food gathering, because it's getting lost when they come out of that community and they're gone for a long time. And there was already a problem with young people coming out of the more rural communities, going to urban centers and not wanting to go back again. And that's all being compounded now. The other piece I would say is that's the education around response and what's happening, moving into children. With Fort McMurray, with the fire there, and then with also the fires in the Lytton area, we found that it was months and months afterwards that children would be able to find the words to talk about how it felt. To have to run away from the fire. We know the fire in Lytton, for example, came so quickly that some people had such little time to leave. The backs of their legs were actually burnt by the flames as they ran away from their place, right? And it took many months for some of the children, and often just through drawings, to describe how frightened they were. Frightened of the fires, frightened of the change, frightened they would have no home, frightened that their parents couldn't protect them anymore. And all of that coming out down the road, which needs help and support. So I think what I'd say to PWRDF is to have a flexibility of approach. I think when climate disasters happen, there is people want to jump in quickly and to fix things and to help with the immediate need, and we need that, and it's really important. But there needs to be, I would say, another thread that comes alongside, which is the long-term education and support of the community to help it to have health restored, and to understand what climate change in general is doing to that community. So I think it's the two parallel things coming alongside. You can't just do one.
Can you describe a little bit and maybe illustrate those connections? So emergencies, displacement, violence.
Well, I think it's the mental health effects of climate disaster and climate change are really far-reaching. And what we've seen across Canada, really, I would say, is that there is an increase in the kinds of coping mechanisms that aren't necessarily healthy. So there's an increase in alcohol, there's an increase in substance abuse in places. There is an increase in people just leaving, as Mary had said, just not being there. And then sometimes, people will come back and the situation isn't how they expected it to be, and nothing is the same in life anymore. So you have very vulnerable people who are trying to hold everything together, and people coming with these big feelings. That's a gross underestimation, but these big feelings of how life should be, and there's these feelings of desperation and loss and despair in some place. Children are seeing increased levels of adults losing it, and just not being able to cope. And so then they are having behaviors modeled for them that are not good behaviors to see. And so this is this kind of multi-generational edge, I think, to gender-based violence, that if we're not very, very careful, it's going to really gain a foothold. I really do believe that, because we're seeing it just after COVID, and then in the climate affected areas, we're seeing it even more. So it's being exacerbated. And I think we've got to be very, very careful.
They are exactly like what Bishop Jane has talked about. I don't think I have something to add. What I want to say is that as we do emergency response, we always say it's life-saving. We need to include gender-based violence as an item for life-saving. Yeah. Because you can give me food, but if I'm abused and psychologically I am damaged, you're gonna not recover me.